My mother was not yet 18 when she met my father. He was 4 years older than she was. They fell in love, and, as often happens in such cases, she became pregnant. After waiting 3 months until my mother turned 18, they got married. Anyway, at the time of the wedding she was 3 months pregnant. Determined not to depend on their parents, they rented a room. So I was born when my mother was not yet 19. She got married right after high school and, of course, my mother had no education except secondary school. My father by that time had graduated from Polytechnic Institute and was working at the factory as a foreman of the preparations area in the machine shop. My mother was on maternity leave, and my father earned money and helped her as much as he could to raise me. He filled in for her at night, giving her a break from the perpetually screaming baby. Washed and ironed diapers, ran to get medicine when I was sick. Basically did everything a loving husband and father should do. When my mother came out of maternity leave, she went to medical school, majoring in medicine, and I was given to live with my grandmother, my mother's mother. Medical school was in another city, so that my mother I saw very rarely, mostly when she came on vacation. Her arrival was for me not just a holiday, but rather a universal event. I remember well how the three of us used to take walks together, go to the movies. When my mother was home I was allowed to watch television late into the night. One bad thing, vacations were ending soon, and she was leaving for another city to continue her studies. Then the gray days of waiting for my mother would begin again. My dad supported me as much as he could. He took me to his place on weekends, taught me how to ski and skate. He also took me to first grade. I still remember how we went with him to meet my mother when she came for the vacations. The train came late at night, and I had to walk 3 kilometers to the station. Dad would take me on his shoulders and we would walk for a long time along the night road. I felt so good that sometimes I even fell asleep on his shoulders. Mom graduated when I was in the 2nd grade. She did 6 years of schooling and returned home to continue her internship. She was assigned to our city hospital. By that time my father had already bought an apartment, so nothing interfered with our happy family life. I must say that my mother was a very beautiful girl in her youth. She had a slender figure, blonde hair, and piercing blue eyes. Understandably, my father lost his head after the first meeting. Over the years her beauty has not only not faded, but on the contrary, it has blossomed and shone in new colors. And 30 years later, my mom was mistaken for a young girl. When I walked down the street with her, everyone thought we were a couple in love, not mother and son. After school I went to the Aviation Institute, and by the time I was 23 I was a pilot. I was lucky enough to work on domestic airlines for 6 months, and then I was sent to South Africa as a co-pilot on the Embraer. Our plane flew charter flights all over Africa. We also flew to Paris, London, Washington. After a year of work, the first pilot went home for family reasons, and I took his place. I went home a couple of times. I was always greeted at the airport by my father and a dazzlingly beautiful young woman, my mother. And so my time abroad was coming to an end. I bought gifts for my parents. My mother a set of French cosmetics, and my father a magnificent selection of collectible tin soldiers. My father loved to tinker with them in his spare time. He made dioramas of battles, trying to keep historical authenticity. The plane landed and taxied to the terminal. I took my time getting dressed, let the passengers who were always in a hurry to leave the plane through, took my bag, thanked the stewardess, and got off the plane. I went through passport control, got my luggage, and began to look for my parents in the crowd of people meeting me. It seemed that they were delayed, but I was not upset and went to the cab rank thanks to the fact that there were no problems with that nowadays. When I got out of the airport building and walked to the parking lot, a familiar voice called me. I looked around and saw my mother getting out of the chic car and waving to me. Wow, did they win the lottery? To buy a car like that. My mom looked absolutely stunning. Beautifully styled hair, cream coat, light silk scarf and high-heeled shoes. It was definitely a lottery. Mom, you're alone. Where's Dad? Isn't he sick, by any chance? Get in the car, Yura. So much has happened. We'll talk on the way. I sat in the back seat, next to Mom. The driver and a young man sat in the front. As soon as I closed the door, he turned and asked my mother. "Where are we going, Helen?" "Home, Misha," Mom answered in a very hostile way, looked at me and smiled. "Yura, it's been 6 months since I left Vitalik. I now live with the man I love. I didn't want to tell you about it while you were working. I didn't want to worry you. My current husband's name is Sergey. He is my first and only love. Fate separated us, but 2 years ago we met again and could not part." She was visibly worried, her face flushed, her eyes glittered excitedly. I did not immediately realize that Vitalik she calls my father. But that was not all. My mother told me that he was not my real father. In fact, my father was her husband Sergey. When my mom got pregnant, he had to leave her under pressure from his parents. And my mom had to marry Vitalik, that the child, that is, me, had at least some father. But all these years she loved Sergey. Mom was still saying something, but I couldn't hear her anymore. My heart was pounding in my throat and my ears were ringing. I asked where my father was, Vitalik. My mother shrugged her shoulders nervously and assumed that he was at home, in our old apartment. "He's playing soldiers, he's out of his mind." I could hear the contempt in her voice. "Where are we going now?" I asked. "Home, my son. We live in the countryside in a cottage community. We have a 3-story house. Sergey, your real father, is a big businessman. We prepared a room for you on the 2nd floor. Wait till you see for yourself." Mom smiled and somehow bird-like kissed me on the cheek, leaving a lipstick mark on it. We finally arrived at a big 3-story house, surrounded by trees and lawns. On the doorstep we were met by a man who was no longer young, but very imposing. As I realized the same Sergey. Mother jumped out of the car like a dragonfly and kissed him on the lips. "Sergey, this is Yura, your son." She hugged Sergey and pushed him towards me. "Well, hello, son." Sergey stepped towards me and held out his hand. "Hello." His palm was somehow sluggish and damp. "Come on in, it's your house." He pretended to smile and made an inviting gesture. I turned to my mother. "I still have things to do. I have to go to the airline office, report my arrival." I took a box of cosmetics out of my bag. "This is for you, Mom." "Oh, thank you." She shook her luxurious hair. "How nice, son." I looked at my mother, knowing full well that she doesn't need these cosmetics now. Her Sergey will buy her a whole perfume store, if necessary. But the rules of etiquette had to be observed. "Stay for breakfast, then go." Mom took me by the arm. "Wash my face, rest from the road." "Come on, then, business comes first." "Helen, a man has to do things first." Sergey smiled. "Let him go, and we'll wait. Take my car, the driver will take you and wait as long as necessary. It will be better if I take a cab." "Don't worry." I kissed my mother and walked out of the gate and dialed the number of the cab. Only when I got in the cab did the full meaning of what had happened come to me. My mother had lived with my father for 27 years. No quarrels, no scandals, always even. I always thought they loved each other. But as soon as Sergey showed up, my mother didn't hesitate to leave my father and rush off to him for her happiness. And she drags me with her. "And the old husband? You helped raise someone else's child, you can be free." She's made her decision, and I have to rush headlong into the arms of my new father. A father is not the one who conceived, but the one who raised. I've heard that hackneyed phrase more than once. But it turns out it's not really true, or rather not at all. I imagine how my dad must have felt when the wife he loved left him for someone else, and even announced that his son wasn't his either. I was on my way to my dad's old apartment. I didn't care if he was my father or not. I was going to see the father I had always loved. I opened the doors with my key. The apartment was quiet. Walking into the room, I threw my bag on the couch. Nothing had changed. Everything was in its place, as if time had stopped in childhood. I looked around the rooms. My father was nowhere to be found. Maybe he'd gone out to the store or to work. The front door creaked open. I looked around and saw my neighbor in the doorway. "Welcome home, Yura. And Daddy is in the hospital, he has a heart attack." The day before yesterday, the ambulance took him away. The hospital was 2 blocks away from our house, so I walked there. My father was in the general ward. There were 7 other people laid there beside him. On the way, I bought some fruit packets of kefir and juice. "Hi, Daddy," I began in a deliberately cheerful voice. "Instead of going to meet my son, you are hiding in hospitals." My father turned his head. His eyes widened in surprise. "Hello, Yura, welcome home. You see, I've fallen apart. I'm sorry I didn't meet you." "Come on, Dad, I'll get over it. Don't worry about it. I'm here for the long haul. I'll be working on domestic airlines from now on. So, we'll live a little longer. I brought you something there. When we get home, you'll see." "When are they planning to release you?" "I don't know, Yura. They don't say anything yet. We'll have to lie in the hospital at least for a couple of weeks." My father grinned and coughed. I noticed that he called me by my name and never called me his usual Sonny. "Yeah, Mom's work." "Get well, Dad. When you get out of the hospital, we'll go to buy a cottage. Remember, you wanted a house in the country." Dad was silent and looked away. I sat with Father some more, trying to talk on distracted subjects. Then I said goodbye and went to find the attending physician. He reassured me, said that my father had a nervous overstrain, and that with proper care, everything can be fixed. As I left the hospital, I got to thinking. I had an idea. My classmate Igor worked at the Bureau of Forensic Medicine. I dialed his number and made an appointment. My mother called, but I dropped the call. I didn't have time for family meetings right now. "Igor, I want to do a paternity test," I started talking to my classmate. "But you'd be surprised, I already know the result." Having briefly outlined the situation to Igor, I continued. "I need a certificate or conclusion that this is my real father." "Yura, this is official forgery." Igor nervously twirled a box of matches in his hands. "Don't worry, only my father will see it. Help me." Igor stood up from his chair. "So here's the deal. Bring me the biomaterial. It's best if it's my father's hair. And go to the lab yourself, the girls will take samples from you. I'll see you at 4 o'clock today. I'll have an answer by tomorrow night. Just for the sake of our friendship, let's do it quickly." Igor looked at me. "I'll give you 2 reports, one real and one fake. And you decide what to do with them." Leaving the bureau, I dialed my mother's number. I listened to her lament for a long time, then explained that I would spend the night in our old apartment and call her tomorrow. Today I still had a lot to do. It is clear that the next day at the appointed time I was at my classmate's place. There was only one paper on Igor's desk, at the very bottom of which was an impressive stamp. I do not understand, something did not work out. I looked at him anxiously. "On the contrary, everything is all right." Igor handed me the report. "Vitalik is the biological father of Yuri with a probability of 99%. My legs buckled. "What does that mean?" "It means that your father is your father in every sense. So take your report and get out of here." Igor laughed. Half an hour later I was in the hospital with my father. "Hi Dad, how are you? How are you feeling?" I adjusted the blanket, which had moved away. "Thank you, Yura, I'm better. They said they'll let me get up tomorrow." Dad averted his eyes. "Dad, why Yura, not the son? Has something changed in our relationship? Or have you grown less fond of me? Didn't Mom tell you anything?" "She did. I know everything about her new husband and about her non-son," I grinned. "Can you read without your glasses?" I gave my father a report. He read for a long time, and I saw his hands trembling. Then he looked at me. A tear was rolling down his cheek. "Well, shall we buy the dacha?" I smiled. I stayed with my father. I didn't explain much to my mother, and I didn't reproach her for anything. I didn't see any point in it. At first she tried to talk me into moving in with her and her new husband. But eventually she calmed down. I did not tell her anything about the DNA test, and she lived with the certainty that my father is her Sergei. Time passed. I finally married a wonderful girl who worked on my flight crew as a stewardess. A year later we had a son. We named him after his grandfather, Vitalik. All this time I had almost no contact with my mother and categorically forbade her to come over to our place. My father never remarried, although I periodically introduced him to different women. And then the hour came when my father died. I buried him next to his parents, as he had requested. A year later my mother's husband Sergei died as well. Mom was still living in the cottage. She didn't work, and she entrusted her husband's business to the manager. One day I yielded to my wife's pleas and decided to visit my mother with my family. I was met by a well-groomed, beautiful woman. She kissed me and my wife and suddenly froze like a stone. A deathly pallor spread over her face. She saw Vitalik, her grandson. It seemed as if her first husband was standing in front of her, only very young. As he had been in those distant years, when she was a young girl about to marry him. She understood everything at once. "God, what have I done?" she whispered. "What have I done?" Story 2. I am a 40-year-old male, and my wife is 32 years old. We had just moved into a new neighborhood, and we didn't know anybody there. Thankfully, through our children, we were able to meet some cool couples that we could hang out with. One of those couples, let's call them Larry and Pam, was especially cool to us. We had a lot of the same interests, and they lived this sort of jet-setting lifestyle, even though they had kids. It was something that my wife and I thought was impossible before we met them. The four of us hit it off, and we spent a lot of time together. It helped that our children were close in age too. It worked out very well, and when we wanted to go out on double dates, we could travel, and we had them to talk to about things going on with our kids. After a few months of knowing them, I started to notice that Larry was a little flirty. I joked about it one time when he was flirting with my wife, telling him to back off because she's taken. Pam shrugged her shoulders and assured me that he was just a flirt and didn't mean anything by it. I was confident in my relationship, and I wasn't worried about a little flirting. I've always been under the impression that it was harmless as long as it didn't evolve into anything else. But the flirting continued. It happened often enough that I was starting to get a little uncomfortable with it. My wife was gorgeous. This isn't to say that Pam wasn't, but Larry would have been crazy not to notice my wife. I wasn't sure if he was respecting our boundaries. Pam and Larry sent their kids to a summer camp every year, and they were able to convince my wife and me to send our kids to the same one. The idea behind it was that if the kids were away for 2 weeks, we could take a grown-up vacation without them. It honestly sounded great. My wife and I were looking forward to going away with them. We thought that it would be a great opportunity to take some time for ourselves and almost have a second honeymoon of sorts. In the weeks leading up to our departure, my wife had been growing a little distant. I chalked it up to thinking that she was going to miss our kids while we were gone. 2 weeks away from them was more than we'd ever spent apart, and I knew it would be hard for her. But I noticed that she was making secret phone calls and texting people very privately. I was a little curious about what was happening. The day of the departure came, and we joined Pam and Larry at a vacation rental we all rented together. It was right on the beach, complete with a jacuzzi tub on the porch, a large smoker grill, and high-end luxurious accommodations. It was heavenly. The first night we were there, we bought some beer and wine, and we all sat outside. After I manned the grill and got a little tipsy, I noticed that my wife and Larry were once again very flirty. I was in high spirits, so I once again laughed it off. I went to bed, and when I woke up the next morning, my wife was not there. As I moved around the house, I saw that she was out by the water in her bathing suit, going for a swim. That would have been fine had Larry not been there with her, shirtless in his swimming trunks, standing very close to her. He was clearly looking her over in her bathing suit, and my wife made no effort to divert his gaze. Right away, I walked out and joined them. They both welcomed me as if nothing was going on, which made me feel a little better. I still didn't like Larry ogling my wife, so I practically dragged him back to the house. Later that night, all of us went out dancing again. We had some drinks and were getting tipsy on the dance floor. I noticed that Larry was gravitating toward my wife. At this point, I was moving past the laughing it off phase. He was constantly around my wife, and it was rubbing me the wrong way. What was even more infuriating about it was that my wife was letting it happen. He would go over to her, put his hands on her waist, and she would lean into him. Did she think it was me? Was she that drunk? I waited until the following morning to ask my wife about it. She laughed it off and told me that I had nothing to worry about. She apparently didn't even remember dancing with Larry. On the third and final day of our vacation, everything hit the fan. We were supposed to stay at the vacation rental for 6 days, but I ended up having to leave early because I walked in on Larry with my wife. We had gone the entire day without any issues, aside from me catching glimpses of Larry looking at my wife in her bikini. I was happy with what my wife had told me, and I wasn't going to worry about it. But, of course, as soon as you let your guard down, you realize that you were right all along. We wanted to throw some stuff on the grill, so I was out back doing that. Pam was with me, helping to skewer some chicken and vegetables. I hadn't even noticed that my wife and Larry were missing. I ran inside to grab some more meat from the fridge, and I heard some shuffling from the laundry room. I paused and listened carefully to what it was. I could hear what was clearly two people trying to be quiet while having sex. I opened the door right away and saw my wife pinned against the wall with Larry in front of her. They were in the middle of having sex, and they were so into it that they almost didn't even notice me walking in. Moments after I opened the door, Pam walked inside to grab some more vegetables and saw them too. She screamed at Larry, and he jumped backward, dropping my wife on the ground. Both of them looked at us like deer in headlights. They never thought we would catch them. I just walked away and went to pack my bags to leave. My wife chased me up to the room and tried to beg me not to leave and to forgive her. She said that he meant nothing. He had just been there at the right time. I had absolutely nothing to say to that. Was the laundry room the right time? It didn't make any sense, and I was done with it. I told her to get away from me, and she did. I noticed that her phone was on the nightstand in the bedroom, charging.so. I went through her phone just to see how long it had been going on. It had been going on for weeks from what I could tell. It seems like she and Larry had been messaging each other about how excited they would be to go to the beach house. Larry told my wife that he was more excited to see her in a bathing suit than anything else. At first, my wife replied, saying that it was inappropriate, but he then pursued it more. She ended up confessing to him that she had thought he was attractive, and she didn't mind a little secrecy in her life. They met up once before we all went to the beach house and had sex in our kitchen. I found Pam, and I told her about everything I learned through my wife's phone. She was just as hurt as I was. She and I ended up leaving the beach house together and going back home. The entire drive back, we were talking about how angry we were and how we wanted to ruin their lives. They didn't get to cheat on us and just be happy. When I got married, my mother encouraged me to get a prenuptial agreement. I wasn't the wealthiest person in the world, but I had received an inheritance before I met my wife, and I had a comfortable nest egg on top of that. I had a good job that paid me well and gave me good benefits. It was enough so my wife didn't have to work. Our agreement clearly stated that if we were to divorce, she would be given a percentage of my assets, with the exception of if we divorced due to her infidelity or her betrayal of our marital vows. Because she cheated, I could leave her without fear of losing a penny. That was the best thing that I could think of to get her. My wife didn't come home until the following day, which made me question if she was just taking advantage of the time she had with Larry. I told her about how we would be getting divorced and how I wanted her out of the house. She swore that I couldn't do that to her. She told me that she would have rights and that in our divorce, she was entitled to half of everything. It almost seemed like she wanted that all along. I questioned if she ever loved me to begin with. I reminded her about our prenuptial agreement, and I watched the indignation in her eyes fade as she realized she was going to be completely screwed. Pam and I both ended up divorcing our spouses. I didn't have to pay a cent to my wife, and I ended up selling the house. Now I'm just trying to pick up the pieces that were left behind in all the mess. I know that there are still some good people out there, but I just have to find them. I can't believe you had to go through all of that. It's heartbreaking to find out that your partner is cheating on you, and it's so much worse when it's with a friend. You were definitely right to be suspicious about Larry's flirting with her. For anyone to blatantly flirt with a married woman in front of their wife, they clearly don't have any respect for boundaries. The fact that they were stupid enough to continue their affair while all of you were at the house is honestly baffling. It doesn't even seem like they were trying to hide what they were doing. I'm glad you were able to come out on top in the divorce. It definitely sounds like she was banking on being favored by the courts. Your mother was smart when she convinced you to sign the prenup. I can't help but wonder if she saw something in your wife that you didn't. I hope that you and Pam can move past this and find new partners who will treat you properly. I wish you the best. Story 3. My wife and I met 8 years ago in a bar. She was attractive and single, and so was I. We hit it off, and after that, we pursued a relationship together. She gave me some of the best years of my life. We started a family, and I really thought that we were going to grow together. Unfortunately, I found out that she was having an affair with her boss, and because of that, we divorced. It was one of the most difficult things I've ever had to experience, and I just want to find a way to move on from it. But here's the story anyway. We had just bought a house, and we were undergoing a lot of stress with remodeling and moving. On top of that, both my wife and I were working a lot in our respective careers to try to make our way up the ladder. I work as a copywriter, and she is a journalist. She was very close with her boss and all the other employees at the paper she worked for. I know that she saw her boss as sort of a mentor for her. When she started, he helped her master writing in her field, and he often gave her special stories to cover that fit her interests. I knew the man well also. He was a widower, and my wife had a lot of sympathy for him because she was worried about him being alone all the time. His children had moved out of the house, and he lived by himself. At first, I thought the relationship was harmless. Years had gone by, and he was more of a father figure to her than anything else. Finding out that he was the person she had been having an affair with was beyond shocking. I started to notice that things were off when she was spending more time in the office. Her job is one that she doesn't even have to go into. She has a home office that she can work from whenever she wants to, but she chooses to go in because it helps her focus and she enjoys socializing with her coworkers. When she told me that she would have to be staying late, I questioned why she wouldn't just come home and work in the office. Certainly, that was better than staying in an office building by herself. She could have had dinner with her family and then gone right to work. Having it happen one time would have been something to forget about, but when she was staying late in the office 2 or 3 times a week, I had some red flags waving. Normally, I wouldn't assume that she was cheating on me, but I had read a lot of Reddit posts and confessions from people who were being cheated on. I started to worry if maybe that was the case here. I honestly didn't even know where to begin with trying to find out if she was cheating on me. I decided that the best thing to do would be just to observe some of her habits and behaviors and see if everything was all in my head. The more I watched her, the more I realized there might have been something going on. Another thing that I noticed was how she would tilt her phone away from me when she looked at it. It was odd. That wasn't something she had ever done before that I was aware of. If she wasn't trying to hide anything, I didn't understand why she would tilt it. I was starting to work myself up, thinking that she was having an affair, so I decided to take the plunge and hire someone who could dig around. I found a local private investigator who took on the case after I told him everything I was suspicious about. He decided that the best place to start would be at her work. He waited outside around the end of her workday to see if he could follow her and see where she was going. On the second day that he was working, I got a text message from my wife telling me that she would be staying late in the office. I immediately told the private investigator about that so they would keep a close eye on her building to see where she went if she left. However, she didn't leave the office. When she eventually did, the private investigator followed her to her house. It seemed like she really was staying late at the office. I told the private investigator that I was clearly in the wrong for what I was doing, and I wanted to call them off. They ended up convincing me that there still could have been something going on in the office. I thought it was silly, but I told them that I would pay for another day just to rule that out, and then if they didn't find anything, I would terminate our contract. Sadly, they found something. My wife was yet again staying late in the office, and the private investigator found her in her boss's office performing oral sex on him. He got some pictures and videos of it for me. When he showed me, I was shocked and disturbed, and I felt like the world was falling out from under my feet. I had my suspicions, but I never wanted to confirm them. Part of me had been hoping that hiring the private investigator would just prove that my wife was faithful. Her boss was like a father figure to her, so I couldn't comprehend how they even started an affair. Regardless of my confusion, I was done with her. I had given her everything I possibly could, and she was throwing it back in my face. I felt a lot of pity for myself, but after wallowing in that for a while, I was angry. I wanted to show them that they couldn't both just treat me the way they did without there being consequences. There was a rival newspaper in the area that I remembered my wife always talking about. Her paper and the other were always trying to one-up each other. I had the perfect story for them. Before I sent an article to the rival magazine, I met with the HR manager of the newspaper my wife worked at. I told them about everything that happened and how they were having sex in the office, showing them the evidence. It was a clear violation of their policy, and they assured me that they would both be dealt with. 2 days after I did that, my wife came home in tears, complaining about how she was fired. She didn't tell me what happened. She lied and said that she was laid off due to budget cuts. I was partially surprised that she continued with the lie, but at the same time, she had already lied so much. When I knew that she was fired, I sent an email to the newspaper. I got a response saying that they were going to cover the story, but they needed to put a spin on it to make it more marketable. Otherwise, it would have just looked like revenge porn. The story that they ran with was about a boss sleeping with his worker and getting them both fired. They put the picture I attached in, though they blurred the faces of my wife and her boss. Because my wife worked for the rival paper, we never had that one at home. However, that morning, I made a special stop to go and grab the latest issue of the newspaper. I sat right at the kitchen table and opened it up in front of her while I drank my coffee. Right on the back of the paper was the article with a picture of her in her boss's office performing sexual acts on him. She nearly spit out her coffee when she saw it. She yanked it out of my hand and read the article while I sat there with my arms crossed in front of me. She didn't say anything, probably because she didn't think I realized what was on the paper. As she was reading it, I commented on how funny it was that the article mentioned a boss and an employee getting fired the very same day that she was. That clued her into my knowledge about her affair. She tried to explain herself and told me that it was a one-time thing, but I didn't believe her. She was mad that I had the article published. In hindsight, I do feel like I went a little too far with that. We lived in a small town, and everybody saw that article. It wouldn't have taken a lot of brainpower to figure out who it was. We ended up getting a divorce. We had a prenup, so thankfully, I didn't owe her anything. We sold the house and split everything down the middle. It's just hard to believe that something like this would happen to me. I've been loyal and trustworthy throughout our entire marriage, and I never expected that. I know it's going to take a lot to move on from, but I'm hoping I can heal soon. I'm so sorry you had to go through something like that. It's difficult to admit to yourself that there's the possibility your partner is cheating, but you do need to trust your gut in some situations. You definitely did the right thing by hiring a private investigator to do the digging for you when you didn't know how. From the way it sounds, their affair had been going on for quite some time. It's curious to think about how they started their affair when their relationship was very clearly almost father-daughter-like. It's always so interesting to me when people have affairs in the office they work in and don't expect anybody to ever catch them. In my opinion, that's just karma coming and getting back at you. I hope you're able to heal from this, and you won't let this hold you back in future relationships. Story 4. I, 34, recently divorced my ex-wife, 29, because she cheated on me and destroyed everything we struggled to build together. I met my wife at a bar for a friend's birthday. It wasn't like we went there to relax. We attended my friend's birthday hangout, and she only tagged along with her friend who knew the celebrant. At the hangout, we got along well, and I liked her. After the party, we exchanged contacts, and I offered to give her and her friend a ride home. From that night, we became close and chatted occasionally online. During the first few months I knew her, we didn't see each other because I had a girlfriend then, and my wife and I were only friends. But after my ex-girlfriend broke up with me, my wife and I became close, and in no time, we were inseparable. We ended up dating for 2 years plus, and we married. In the first year of our marriage, everything was beautiful and pleasing. We both worked hard and tried our best to keep everything rolling. However, in the second year of our marriage, my wife had to stop working because she became pregnant, and her pregnancy had a lot of complications. The complications were so much that I feared the child would not make it, but thankfully she gave birth to a healthy baby. Throughout the time she stayed home to rest, I worked morning and night to ensure I raised enough money to pay the bills and take care of other necessary things, including getting baby stuff. Fast forward to after she gave birth, my wife insisted that she remain home to nurse the baby for 6 months before she resumed work, even though this meant more responsibility on my shoulder. I agreed to it because I loved my wife and the baby, and I did not want her to feel uncomfortable. I sacrificed so much, believing that I was making life easier for my wife, but I was only fooling myself and working hard for nothing. Most people say that when their wives cheat, there are always cues, but even as I share my story, I'm still shocked that my wife could cheat on me under my nose. I will also say I blame myself because I should have been more vigilant. But I didn't see any signs because I trusted her so much and did not think she would cheat on me. It was even more painful that after 4 years of being married to the woman I thought loved me, I discovered she had been cheating on me from our first year of marriage. The day I found out, I accidentally stumbled upon some intimate voicemails on our home line. After listening to all of them, I was broken, so broken that I could not stand up from the ground where I sat. At first, when I heard her voice, I thought they were messages she had left at her office, as they went way back. Aside from recognizing her voice, I also recognized our next-door neighbor's voice. The shocking part was that he was a pastor and was flirting with my wife. He was the kind of religious church pastor who talks to everyone he meets about God and the rest, even making you feel like some sinner if you didn't listen to him. This was his personality. If I say hearing the intimate voicemails between him and my wife came as a shock, it's an understatement. Another shocking thing was that they kept mentioning my son's name in our conversations, and this neighbor of mine asked after my son almost every time he sent a voicemail. By this time, my son was almost 3 years old, and all the thoughts of me not being his biological father crossed my mind. So I secretly conducted a paternity test that same week. When the results came out, I was shattered. We were not a match. It felt like a bad dream, and I wanted to wake up, but I couldn't because it was reality. Meanwhile, my attitude towards my wife had totally changed. I was literally like a ticking time bomb, waiting to explode, and I wanted to confront her and kick her and her baby out of the house. But I came up with a better plan, a plan that would publicly humiliate her and bring her infidelity to the limelight. 4 days after I got the paternity test results, I lied to my wife that I had been promoted at the office, and she was so excited. To mark my promotion, I suggested that we throw a small party and invite our close neighbors, her parents, and my parents to come and celebrate with me, and she agreed. We made the necessary preparations, and I invited the neighbors myself, including her affair partner. On D-Day, 2 days after, her parents and my parents came as I had invited them, and her affair partner, with his wife and daughter, came too. To mock him, I asked him to do an opening prayer for our party, and he did that with glee. I had already collected evidence of their affair, including phone records and voicemail transcripts. The party started on a good note, and everyone who came congratulated me for the promotion. While everyone was drinking and chatting, I asked the DJ I hired to change the song to my preferred song. I paid him extra to keep it playing no matter how everyone reacted. My preferred song was a compilation of all the voicemails between my wife and my neighbor. When the audio started, nobody understood what was happening until my wife recognized her voice and her affair partner recognized his voice. Not just that, his wife recognized her husband's voice, and all hell broke loose. She created a scene and hit him continuously in the presence of everyone, and he could not even defend himself. On the other hand, my wife's face turned pale as she froze while the whole drama between her affair partner and his wife was going on. I called everyone's attention and told them my wife had something important to tell me and her family, and she was confused. Her eyes were already filled with tears, and she could not even look her disappointed parents in the eye. When I told her to go ahead and tell everyone who her son's biological father was, her eyes widened, and she started stuttering. At that point, everyone was quiet, and everyone's eyes were on my wife, including her affair partner's wife. At this point, I was so mad and could not contain my anger anymore. I yelled at her, and she hesitated. She mentioned her affair partner's name, and everyone gasped. His wife fell to the ground in disbelief, and people had to rush to her. At the same time, my wife went on her knees and told me she could explain. She said something about her affair partner coming over to preach to her on a particular day, and it happened. So when she found out she was pregnant for him, the only thing she could do was pin the pregnancy on me as her husband, and she didn't tell me because she would hurt my feelings. But as time passed, she and her affair partner got close and fell in love. On the other hand, her affair partner wanted to be in his son's life, so she told him she would tell her son who his biological father was when he turned 18. Hearing this even broke me, and people began to yell at her, calling her names for being so cruel. Her parents left shamefully, and I threw her and her son out of the house. It's quite painful that she could actually do that to me after all my years of sacrifices and love. The irony is I have listened to so many stories of mismatched paternity results on this channel, but I believed my wife was faithful and could never do something like that. LOL, so much for trust. Anyways, we divorced, but before we divorced, she got an earful from our neighbors the couple of times she had come to beg me to give her another opportunity. My female neighbors would quickly rush their children away from her whenever they saw her, like she was some closet monster. As for her affair partner, his wife could not stand the shame, so she divorced him. I heard something else happen at his church when members learned about his infidelity and child, but it's not my business. He also moved out of the neighborhood after his marriage ended because he could not stand the looks of disgust and disappointment from the same neighbors he used to preach to. It's barely a year since this happened, and I'm still healing. I advise every father out there or expecting father to conduct a paternity test at birth or before birth if you have doubts. This is the worst kind of heartbreak I have ever experienced, and I hope I heal entirely from it. As for relationships, I doubt I'll be in one anytime soon. I'll rather focus on myself and my career and maybe start a business YouTube channel that I've always wanted to. I'm sorry you had to learn your lesson the hard way. I'm glad you handled this well. Your ex-wife had no place in your life, and there will never be a good enough reason for infidelity. Take as much time as you need to heal. There's no rush at all. Start your YouTube channel if you want to and do what makes you happy. Consider this as good riddance of bad rubbish. Thank you for sharing your story with us. Story 5. I, 29, male, and my ex-wife, 28, female, were married for barely 3 years before I discovered something that shattered our marriage. My wife and I knew each other from college but only dated 3 years after graduating. One of the things I loved about my wife was that we were like-minded and believed in a simple yet happy life. We were also Christians, and she was more devoted than I was. I didn't see this as a red flag because I came from a devoted Christian home, but I was only a Sunday churchgoer and nothing more. On the other hand, my wife was a worker in the church, and I think she functioned in about 3 different departments. This is just to explain how involved she was with church activities. After 3 years of dating, my wife and I married and started life anew. We were so in love with each other, or so I believed, and we had no children. She said something about having kids from age 32, so we could find our feet before we brought babies into the world. I am a very peaceful and quiet person by nature, while my wife was an extrovert. She was the kind of person who literally knew one thing or the other about the neighbors, the people in the church, or whoever she found herself around. So, this is to say, a couple of people did not really like her because they felt she was overdoing it sometimes. As mentioned earlier, I went to church only on Sundays because my job demanded most of my time during the weekdays. My wife worked with shifts and always had her way of fixing her shifts in her favor so it wouldn't clash with her church activities. Throughout our marriage, I admired her dedication, and most times I would tease her and say I'd be like her someday. As a couple, we drove to church together on Sundays and had been doing this for almost 2 years. Our church was small, so everyone knew everyone there, and we were like a big, happy family. When we were getting close to the 2nd year of our marriage, I noticed that my wife and our preacher were getting too close, but I didn't think anything was wrong. My mistake. Most times, if he was in our street, he would drop by our house to either say hello or discuss some things with my wife. Each time I asked her about it, she'd either mention something in church or come up with an excuse. In the end, I didn't think about any of the reasons she gave. I only asked, and whatever response I got from her, I wouldn't think about it. Nothing fishy crossed my mind because I trusted my wife so much, and I didn't even nurse the idea that something could be happening between my wife and her preacher. Most times, he dropped by our house, and I'd ask him to wait for my wife to come home, and I'd try my best to take care of him until my wife returned. I did this most of the time because I respected our preacher a lot, and I felt it was bad to have a man of God over and not treat him as one. For once, I never wondered why our preacher was always driving along our street, like he claimed, and would always drop by my house. It felt natural to me, and I honestly believed our house was not the only house he dropped by. For months, I watched my wife and preacher get close until I got shocking news from his wife. That Sunday, my wife and I went to church as usual and enjoyed the sermon and every bit of the service. After service, while we exchanged pleasantries as usual, our preacher's wife pulled me aside and said she had something to tell me in private. When we had our privacy, she told me something that changed the direction of my marriage. She told me my wife was having an affair with her husband. At first, I thought she was pulling my leg, but it was the truth. According to my preacher's wife, she had been doing some investigations because her husband had been acting differently at home. After she did some digging, she saw that her husband communicated with my wife the most, and she even found some sensual messages between them. To also be sure of what she found out, she hired someone to follow her husband so she could confirm. She told me that every Sunday evening, my wife and her husband, the preacher, would go to a cheap apartment downtown, and they would spend time there for hours before they returned home. Even with everything she said, I didn't believe her because I was convinced that my wife went to work on Sunday evenings. I had dropped her at her place of work a few times, and it didn't make any sense to me. All of my doubts were cleared when she showed me that the preacher had been spending donation money, the same donation money he psychologically brainwashed people to donate, so he could use it for the Lord's work. After hearing enough, I thanked her and got the address of the downtown apartment she talked about. Shortly after that, my wife and I had a long quiet drive back home, and when she asked if I was good, I told her I had some severe stomach upset. When I got home, I pretended to be sick and waited for her to leave for work that evening. A few minutes after she left, I followed her and watched as she picked up her preacher along the road, and they drove to the apartment together. As soon as she pulled over by the road, they stepped out, and her preacher wrapped his hand around her waist, and they kissed. I was already out of my car because I could no longer stand the sight. I turned on my phone camera before confronting them and recording their shocked faces. I shouted at both of them and caused a scene. I asked them to confess that they were having an affair, but our preacher got really defensive, and we struggled. Then he told me I was banned from church. I also told my wife not to bother about coming home, and I drove off angrily. I was heartbroken when I witnessed it, and my wife kept blowing up my phone the whole night. She left multiple voicemails, saying she could explain everything and we needed to talk that night. I could not sleep because I thought about all the areas or things I must have failed as a husband for my wife to cheat on me. The next day, she came by the house and found her bags packed on the front porch. I told her we were done, and she would hear from my lawyer soon. Then I slammed the door in her face. Meanwhile, I posted the recording from that night on our church platform, and everyone was shocked and disappointed. With the help of our preacher's wife, I posted the financial records too. This one, in particular, caused many of our church members to stop going to church, and they insisted they would only return after our preacher was replaced with a new preacher. Eventually, I divorced my wife so she could go and be with her lover, and the preacher's wife did the same thing. The town we lived in was small, so the word spread fast, and she was shunned by our community until she went back to her parents' town. This happened about a year ago, and I still have not gotten over it till now. Women just have their ways of doing the most embarrassing things. I had to stop attending church services so the matter could die down. To date, I feel embarrassed whenever I bump into familiar church members. I may fall in love again, but until then, I'll enjoy my single and peaceful state. Women have their ways of doing the most embarrassing things. Sadly, the woman you loved and wanted to build a future with did such a thing to you. If you ask why, you'll see that she had no reason. Please move on. You didn't fail as a husband. She was the problem, not you. Get over the embarrassment. She should be feeling that way, not you. Meanwhile, enjoy your peaceful life and be happy at all times.